The metallic sound of hammer against aged iron echoed through the Anderson family estate in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. George Anderson, a 45-year-old history teacher, watched helplessly as workers methodically dismantled his grandfather's historic shed. A structure that had stood for more than 150 years, a silent witness to the American Civil War. "Stop! You don't have permission to do this," George shouted, running towards the workers, his shoes sinking into the mud left by the previous night's rain. His heart was pounding violently against his chest as he watched pieces of history being torn off and thrown into a rusty bucket. Jennifer White, the treasurer of the Oak Ridge Historic District Homeowners Association, stood with her arms crossed near the gate, her impeccable navy blue blazer contrasting with the dirt and clutter around her. His satisfied smile only added to the fury growing inside George. "Mr. Anderson, this property was deemed abandoned after repeated violations of the Historic Preservation Code," Jennifer stated with calculated calm. The sale was perfectly legal. George felt his stomach turn. The shed contained the entire military collection of his grandfather, Sergeant William Anderson, original Civil War uniforms, letters written on the battlefield, strategic maps, and even a rare Union flag that his grandfather had preserved. Historians at the National Civil War Museum had valued the collection at more than $50,000, but its sentimental value was priceless. Legal. "This property isn't even under HOA jurisdiction," George protested, pulling out his cell phone to call the police. "The shed is located outside the boundaries of the historic district." One of the workers emerged from the shed carrying an old wooden box. George recognized it immediately. It was where his grandfather kept his medals of honor. "Put it down right now," he ordered, his voice shaking with anger. Marcus Rodriguez, a lawyer who lived next door and was witnessing the scene from his backyard, quickly approached. "Jennifer, you're making a serious mistake here," he warned, positioning himself next to George. "As a lawyer, I can assure you that this is misappropriation of private property." Jennifer rolled her eyes, pulling a document from her briefcase. "I have here an authorization signed by the HOA board and a perfectly legal sales contract with Clayton's Junkyard. $500 is more than fair for a deteriorated structure." The arrival of the police vehicle caused the workers to pause momentarily. Officer Robert Martinez, a veteran of the local police force, emerged from the vehicle with a grave expression. He knew well the history of the Anderson family and the importance of the shed to the community. "Mrs. White, we need to see all the documentation related to this sale," Officer Martinez requested, as his partner began photographing the scene. "And please order that work be stopped immediately." George took advantage of the pause to enter the shed, his heart breaking when he saw the state of the place. Shelves that once carefully housed historical artifacts were empty or broken. On the floor, shards of glass from displays mingled with trampled historical papers. "My grandfather dedicated his life to preserving this history," George murmured, picking up a dusty photo of Sergeant William Anderson in his Union uniform. He survived Gettysburg to see it all destroyed by greed and pettiness. Marcus put a hand on his shoulder. "Let's turn this around, George. Jennifer clearly exceeded her authority, and the HOA will be held accountable for every penny of damage." As the police conducted their initial investigation, other important figures in the community began to come forward. Dorothy Miller, a 70-year-old local historian, wept openly when she saw the state of the shed. "This is a crime against our history," she declared, documenting the damage with her camera. Jennifer began to show signs of nervousness when Officer Martinez pointed out several irregularities in the documents presented. The HOA president's signature appeared to be forged, and there was no official record of the meeting where the sale was supposedly approved. "I will need to take these documents in for review," the officer informed him. "Mrs. White, I suggest you contact your attorney immediately." George watched the proceedings with a mixture of anger and sadness. Much of the collection had already been sold or destroyed in the last 48 hours, since Jennifer had carried out her sneaky plan. The owner of Clayton's junkyard confirmed that several metal items had already been processed and some documents discarded as garbage. "I'm going to sue every single person involved in this," George declared, his voice firm despite his emotion. "Not just for the monetary value, but for every piece of history that has been stolen from our community." Marcus was already on his phone, contacting colleagues specializing in heritage law and crimes against historical heritage. Word was beginning to spread through the small community of Gettysburg, and reporters from the local newspaper were arriving to document the event. Jennifer White tried to quietly escape during the confusion, but was stopped by Officer Martinez. "Mrs. White, we'll need your full statement at the police station," he informed her, leading her towards his vehicle. As the sun began to set over Gettysburg, George stood in the ruins of his grandfather's shed, holding the old photograph. The battle ahead would be different from the one his grandfather had fought in those same fields, but no less important for preserving history and justice. "I'm going to fix this, Grandpa," he whispered to the photograph, "even if it's the last thing I do." In the early hours of the next morning, George Anderson was sitting in his kitchen, spreading documents out on the table, while Marcus Rodriguez meticulously examined each paper. The lawyer had spent the entire night researching similar legal precedents, and his findings were disturbing. "Jennifer White has an interesting history," Marcus commented, turning his laptop around to show George. "In the last 5 years, she's been involved in 3 similar property clearing cases in other districts, always using the same tactics: allegations of abandonment, flash sales, dubious documentation." Dorothy Miller, the local historian, walked into the kitchen carrying a dusty box. "I found these hidden under some rubble in the shed," she announced, placing the box on the table. "These are photographic records that your grandfather kept of the regular maintenance of the shed. We have repair receipts here dating back as far as 3 months ago." George picked up the photographs with trembling hands. Each image was irrefutable proof that the property was well maintained, completely destroying Jennifer's abandonment argument. "This is gold," Marcus muttered, organizing the photos chronologically. George's phone rang. It was Clayton Henderson, the owner of the junkyard. "Mr. Anderson, after consulting with my lawyer, I've decided to cooperate fully," he said, his voice laden with guilt. "Mrs. White assured me that I had all the necessary permits, but something didn't smell right to me about all that haste. I need a detailed list of everything that was sold or destroyed," George replied, his tone firm but controlled, "and any documentation of the transaction." Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Officer Martinez was conducting a thorough search of Jennifer White's office at HOA headquarters. The preliminary investigation had revealed a disturbing pattern of doctored documents and forged signatures. "Officer, I found something," called out her partner, Detective Lisa Chen, lifting a folder marked Special Projects. Inside, there were detailed notes on several historic properties in the area, including the Anderson shed, with estimated values and possible buyers. Back at George's house, Marcus received an important call. "The president of the HOA, Richard Palmer, is in shock," he informed him. "He never authorized this sale. In fact, he's been out of the country for 3 weeks on a cruise in the Mediterranean." Dorothy, who had started cataloging the recovered items, let out an exclamation. "George, look at this!" she called out, holding up a yellowed envelope. It was a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs, dated 1865, officially recognizing Sergeant William Anderson's service in the Battle of Gettysburg. "We need to activate the press," Marcus suggested, noting George's emotional reaction. "This isn't just about private property. It's about historic preservation, about honoring our veterans." As if answering the call, Karen Mitchell, a reporter for the Gettysburg Times, appeared at the front door. "Mr. Anderson, we heard about this and we'd like to cover the story," she said, notepad in hand. The story spread quickly. Within hours, historic preservation groups, veterans associations, and outraged residents began to speak out. The pressure on the HOA grew exponentially. Jennifer White was called in for a formal interrogation. Sitting in the cold police station room, her arrogant demeanor began to crumble in the face of the evidence presented. "It was just an old shed," she insisted, but her voice trembled. "An old shed?" Detective Chen questioned, sliding the photos of the destroyed historical documents across the table. "We're talking about National Historic Heritage, Mrs. White. This could result in federal charges." As the investigation deepened, George and Marcus worked tirelessly to trace the items sold. Clayton Henderson provided a detailed list, and a network of collectors and antique dealers was tapped. "We managed to locate the Union flag," Marcus reported, checking his email. "A collector in Philadelphia bought it for $200, but is willing to return it for the same amount when he hears the story." The community mobilized. A group of veteran carpenters offered to help rebuild the shed. The National Civil War Museum provided experts to help recover and restore the damaged documents. Dorothy coordinated the cataloging efforts, turning George's garage into a makeshift restoration center. "Every piece of paper, every object tells a story," she explained to the volunteers who joined the effort. As more evidence emerged, it became clear that Jennifer White had not acted alone. Her cleanup operation had connections to a larger scheme of appropriation and resale of historic properties. "This goes far beyond a simple corrupt treasurer," Marcus observed, connecting the dots. "We're dealing with an organized network that targets vulnerable historic properties." George spent the sleepless night reviewing old photographs of his grandfather in the shed. Each image reinforced his determination to not only recover what had been lost, but to ensure that something like this never happened to another family again. "Grandpa always said that history isn't just about the past," George reflected, showing Dorothy a photo. "It's about preserving lessons for the future." The fight was far from over, but for the first time since the beginning of that nightmare, George felt that truth and justice were on his side. The story of Sergeant William Anderson and his precious shed would not end with a fraudulent sale of $500. The discovery of an old safe buried under the floor of the shed changed everything. During the work to recover the rubble, one of the veteran volunteers noticed an irregularity in the floorboards. After careful removal, they found a metal box with the Union emblem on it. "My God," whispered George, his hands shaking as he opened the box with a key he had always carried with him, a gift from his grandfather that he had never known what it was for. Inside, there was something that made Jennifer White lose sleep in prison. Documents proving that she wasn't the first to try to illegally appropriate that property. "Letters dated 1890, Dorothy announced, adjusting her reading glasses. "Your great-grandfather documented attempts by local groups to seize the land claiming historical purposes. It was an old scheme that kept repeating itself." Marcus leafed through the documents with growing interest. "That explains why your grandfather was so protective of the shed. He wasn't just preserving history, he was protecting a legacy of resistance against corruption." Detective Chen arrived on the scene with new information. "We discovered suspicious bank transfers in the HOA's account. Mrs. White didn't act alone. There's a real estate development company involved, the Heritage Development Corporation." "HDC?" George choked. "They've been buying up a lot of historic properties in the area. They say it's for preservation, but they end up demolishing everything to build luxury condominiums." The investigation quickly expanded. Karen Mitchell of the Gettysburg Times published a series of stories exposing how HDC had systematically corrupted officials of HOAs in 3 different states to facilitate the acquisition of historic properties. "It's not just about money," explained Richard Palmer, the HOA president, now back from his trip. "They're erasing our history, replacing historic landmarks with generic developments." The community has mobilized even more. War veterans organized nightly vigils to protect other historic properties. Historians across the country began documenting similar cases, revealing a disturbing pattern of destruction of American heritage. Jennifer White finally broke. In a plea bargain, she revealed names, dates, and amounts. "HDC promised me a penthouse in their new development," she tearfully confessed. "I was supposed to facilitate the acquisition of several historic properties in the district." The FBI became involved in the case, expanding the investigation into an interstate operation. Agents uncovered an elaborate money laundering and real estate fraud scheme using HOAs as a front to legitimize illegal transactions. "Your grandfather saw this coming," Dorothy told George, showing a letter found in the safe. "He wrote about how some would try to use progress as an excuse to erase our history. That's why he left so many proofs and documents." The reconstruction of the shed was progressing. The community was not only restoring a physical structure, but strengthening its bonds. Veterans shared stories. Young people learned about their past, and everyone understood the importance of preserving their heritage. "Every nail we put back is an act of resistance," declared Mike Peterson, a Vietnam veteran carpenter. "We're saying that our history is not for sale." The National Civil War Museum organized a special exhibition on Sergeant Anderson's collection, highlighting not only the military artifacts, but also the ongoing struggle to preserve American history. The exhibition has become a symbol of the growing movement against the destruction of historical heritage. "Your grandfather would be the first to tell you that this isn't just a legal battle," Marcus commented, watching volunteers work in the shed. "It's a battle for the soul of our community." HDC tried to defend itself through its corporate lawyers, but the evidence was overwhelming. Leaked emails revealed a deliberate strategy of historic cleansing to maximize real estate profits. "They thought no one would care about an old shed," George reflected, holding up a photo of his grandfather. "They didn't understand that every board, every document, every story matters." The Andersons case became a legal precedent. Legislators began proposing stricter laws to protect historic properties. HOAs across the country revised their governance and transparency policies. Dorothy organized a digital archive of all the recovered documents, creating an educational resource for future generations. "History isn't just about preserving the past," she explained to a group of visiting students. "It's about understanding who we are and what we fought for." Jennifer White, now cooperating fully with the authorities, has provided crucial information about other similar ongoing schemes. Her snitching has led to more arrests and the recovery of other threatened historic properties. "Sometimes you have to lose something to understand its true value," she admitted during her final testimony. "I thought I was just facilitating real estate deals, but I was helping to destroy the fabric of our community." The reconstruction of the shed has become a model historic restoration project. Architects, conservators, and historians worked together to ensure that every detail was faithfully preserved, while discreet modern adaptations protected the artifacts for generations to come. "This was never just about a shed," George declared during a community ceremony. "It was about honoring those who came before us and protecting their stories for those who will come after." The conference room of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Harrisburg was buzzing with activity. Agents, prosecutors, and investigators gathered around a board covered in photos, documents, and red lines connecting people and events. In the center was an enlarged photo of the Andersons' shed before it was destroyed. "The pattern is clear," declared Special Agent Rachel Morgan, pointing to a series of bank transactions. The Heritage Development Corporation wasn't just buying up properties, it was systematically erasing the history of entire communities. George Anderson, sitting next to Marcus, watched as the agent detailed how HDC had manipulated neighborhood associations in dozens of towns. Jennifer White was just one piece in a much bigger puzzle. "We found connections with local politicians, real estate appraisers, even employees of historic preservation departments," Morgan continued. "They were creating fake emergencies, forging code violations, and pressuring owners to sell." The investigation had turned into one of the largest real estate fraud operations in Pennsylvania history. The safe found in the Andersons' shed provided not only historical evidence, but also a roadmap of how similar schemes had been attempted in the past. Dorothy Miller, who had become an expert in documenting the case, presented her most recent findings. "Sergeant Anderson wasn't just collecting Civil War memorabilia," she explained, projecting images onto the screen. "He was building a detailed archive of attempts to appropriate historic properties throughout the region." Marcus flipped through a report just arrived from the forensics lab. The forged signatures on HOA documents were not the work of Jennifer White, he revealed. We have evidence linking them directly to HDC headquarters in Philadelphia. The case had become a catalyst for greater change. Historic preservation groups across the country began investigating suspicious transactions in their own communities. HDC's pattern was repeated in states like Virginia, Maryland, and Massachusetts. They underestimated the power of collective memory, George commented, sharing old photos of the shed with investigators. They thought they could just erase the past and build on top. The pressure on HDC increased daily. Investors began to abandon ship, and leaked internal documents revealed a corporate culture of contempt for historical preservation. History is just an obstacle to progress, the CEO had written in a particularly revealing email. Jennifer White, now under house arrest, continued to cooperate. Her whistleblowing had opened doors that investigators didn't even know existed. They had a list, she revealed during a video call: vulnerable historic properties, elderly owners, families in financial difficulty. We were trained to identify easy targets. The impact of the case extended beyond legal issues. Communities began to question the power of HOAs and the importance of historic preservation. In Gettysburg, a growing movement called for a complete overhaul of neighborhood association governance policies. We cannot allow private bureaucracies to have so much power over our heritage, argued Richard Palmer at a public hearing. The HOA president, now an ally in the fight for reform, had become a vocal critic of the association's excesses. The reconstruction of the Anderson shed continued, now with federal support. The site would be transformed into a history education center, combining the preservation of Civil War artifacts with exhibits on the importance of community vigilance against the destruction of historical heritage. Every board recovered, every document restored is a victory, said Mike Peterson, overseeing the reconstruction work. We're rebuilding more than a shed. We're strengthening the foundations of our community. Dorothy coordinated a team of volunteers who digitized and cataloged every item recovered. The digital archive grew daily, becoming a valuable resource for historians and researchers. History is nobody's property, she insisted. It's a common good that we need to protect. George would spend hours in the partially rebuilt shed, sometimes just sitting quietly, other times sharing stories with curious visitors. The place had become a symbol of resistance and preservation. My grandfather always said that history is like a chain, he explained to a group of students. Each generation is a link, and if we allow a link to break, we lose our connection to who we are. The federal investigation was approaching its climax. Search warrants were being executed at HDC offices in 3 states, and company executives were beginning to face criminal charges. The web of corruption and historic destruction was finally crumbling. Marcus was preparing to present the case at a congressional hearing. This goes beyond Gettysburg, he explained to George. It's about setting precedents that protect our cultural heritage across the country. The sun was setting over the reconstructed shed, casting long shadows across the new wooden boards. George held the old photograph of his grandfather, thinking about how a battle for the preservation of history never really ends. Sometimes, he muttered to himself, you have to lose something to truly understand its value. The Anderson shed had become more than a physical structure. It was a testament to resistance against those who would see history as just another asset to be liquidated. The ceremony to reopen the Anderson shed drew hundreds of people on a fall morning in Gettysburg. What had begun as a family tragedy had turned into a national movement for historic preservation. George Anderson, standing in front of the restored shed, watched the crowd that had gathered to celebrate not just a victory over corruption, but a rebirth of community spirit. My grandfather always said that every object in this shed tells a story. George began his speech, his voice carrying the emotion of months of struggle. But the greatest story this place has taught us is about the strength of a community standing together against injustice. Special Agent Rachel Morgan, sitting in the front row, smiled discreetly. The previous morning, she had overseen the arrest of the CEO of the Heritage Development Corporation in Philadelphia. The operation, dubbed Guardians of History, had uncovered a scheme that stretched across 5 states, involving more than 30 threatened historic properties. The documents found in Sergeant Anderson's safe not only saved this property, Morgan would later explain to reporters, they provided us with the model of how these criminal organizations operate, allowing us to identify and prevent dozens of similar cases. Dorothy Miller, now director of the newly created Anderson Center for Historic Preservation, guided small groups through the restored shed. Each section had been meticulously reconstructed, with modern preservation systems discreetly integrated into the original structure. "Look at these marks on the wood," she showed visitors, pointing to ancient carvings on the beams. Union soldiers left their initials here in 1863. Each mark tells a story. Each scratch is a piece of our common heritage. Marcus Rodriguez, who had become one of the country's leading attorneys specializing in historic property rights, was talking to a group of state legislators. The Anderson case had inspired new legislation, dubbed the Heritage Protection Act, that was being considered in several states. "What happened here at Gettysburg exposed a vulnerability in our legal system," he explained. "We cannot allow private organizations like HOAs to have unfettered power over our collective history." Jennifer White, serving her sentence under house arrest, had become a key witness in dozens of similar cases. Her cooperation led to the recovery of millions of dollars in historic properties and the exposure of a network of corruption that stretched to high levels of government. "I thought I was just following orders," she had admitted in her final testimony. "But I was participating in the systematic destruction of American memory. No amount of money can pay for the weight of that guilt." The Anderson shed now served as an active educational center. Schools in the area brought students to learn not only about the Civil War, but also about the importance of citizen vigilance and historic preservation. A special room had been dedicated to documenting the battle itself to save the shed, serving as a warning to future generations. Richard Palmer, the HOA president, who had unwittingly become an advocate of reform, implemented significant changes to the association's governance. Total transparency. Community participation and respect for history are now our fundamental principles, he declared during the ceremony. Mike Peterson and his team of veteran carpenters had become a group specializing in historic restoration, traveling the country to help other communities preserve their historic structures. "Every building we save is a victory against those who would see our history as just another financial asset," he said. The FBI had established a special task force, inspired by the Anderson case, dedicated exclusively to investigating crimes against historical heritage. "What we discovered at Gettysburg was just the tip of the iceberg," Agent Morgan explained. "There is a silent war being waged for control of our national history." George walked through the restored shed, touching the walls his grandfather had protected for so long. The collection, much of which had been recovered through national searches and donations from conscientious collectors, was once again safe in its rightful place. "This place is not just a museum," he explained to a group of visitors. "It's a living reminder that our history is worth fighting to preserve. Every object here represents not only the past, but our determination to protect it for the future." The story of the Anderson shed had become a case study in law schools, an example of how community mobilization and legal perseverance could triumph over corporate greed. But for George, it was something more personal. It was the fulfillment of a promise made to his grandfather. "Sergeant William Anderson fought to preserve our Union," George concluded his speech. "Today, we continue his fight, preserving not only objects and documents, but the values and principles they represent." As the sun set over Gettysburg that historic night, the Anderson shed stood as a beacon of hope and resistance. Its light, now stronger than ever, would continue to guide future generations in the ongoing battle to preserve our common heritage. "History isn't just about the past," George whispered, looking at the photo of his grandfather hanging on the main wall. "It's about the choices we make today to protect tomorrow." The Anderson shed had become more than a restored structure. It was a living symbol of how a united community could face and overcome the forces of greed and oblivion, preserving not just buildings and objects, but the very soul of a nation.